Today marks exactly a year since I kicked off the Silverbird Selection here on YouTube, and in that 12 months I've managed to play exactly 60 games. I've also managed to cultivate a pretty reasonable beard, and I think I've only had my hair cut 3 times, so I'm really looking forward to the barbers opening next week. I want to say thank you to everyone who's been watching the videos throughout this last 12 months. Anyone who's made a comment or liked the video or shared it, thank you very much for your support and participation. So as I said, I've played 60 games in 12 months. You don't need to be a maths whiz to work out that that's 5 games a month on average, which means with about 35 or 36 games to go, I've still got another 7 months of this, so you're stuck with me for at least another 7 months. That takes us through to around about November. So as is customary, after every 10 games, I do a review comparison with ZZap magazine and also the scores on Lemon 64. This time around though, I'm also having to introduce a special guest publication for reasons that will become clear soon enough. So let's head over to the computer and do the review comparison. Right, I'm sure you know how this works by now, but here's the 10 games I'm going to be looking at in this review comparison video. Most of these got quite low scores from me. These were some of the poorest games I've reviewed so far in this series, I would say. A couple of good ones amongst them, but most of them were really quite poor. I wonder how the magazine reviewers and the Lemon 64 users are going to feel about these games. So first up we have Special Agent, which I gave a score of 6.4. Lemon users have given it 5.5. It's a quite big review here from Bronstein, a rather boring and uninspired agent shooting game, elevator action in similar vein. Just as with the latter, I was talking about Joe Blade there, just as with the latter you have to find your way and shoot the baddies. Both tasks are not too demanding. And he mentions the detail that I did about there being Western brands such as Coca-Cola and Adidas, even though it's supposed to be in Russia. Waiting for the elevators and the opening of the doors takes out the action of the game. Another review here says this game just has too little in it. Go from level to level shooting the baddies while opening the doors. Controls are frustrating when getting on or off the elevator, which was something I mentioned in my review. Gameplay wise isn't very exciting. Nice track on the intro screen and nice but blocky graphics. And someone saying the music's superb, and that's about it for the comments. So let's move on to the ZZap score. They gave it 63% in issue 31, November 1987. Quite a short review here, and it's more of the same really. Another variation of gumshoe and elevator action surfaces in the shape of Special Agent. We'll just skip down to the actual review comments rather than going through the plot. So the graphics are smartly drawn, although the characters are rather tiny. Felix's death throws are wonderfully animated. Gameplay though is repetitive and the whole game is too derivative to be considered a truly worthwhile investment. As I said, they gave it 63%, which lines up pretty nicely with my 6.4. So let's move on to the next game. So next up we have Rainbow Dragon. I gave this a score of 6, or that was largely due to the nice graphics and presentation and sound rather than the gameplay. Lemon reviewers have been exceedingly cruel to it, perhaps. It wasn't quite this bad, but they've given it 2.6, and it's actually number 79 in the worst list. That little turd emoji denotes that. Only 18 votes and not many comments either, but let's just have a quick look at it. What were you supposed to do? What a pile of shit. That's fair enough, I suppose. There's a very long transcript of the manual there that someone's gamely put in to try and encourage more people to play it, perhaps. A couple more comments here. I really liked the big dragon when I was younger, and the title music isn't bad at all, but I never got anywhere. The dragon looks good, but there's a little gameplay. What kind of shit was this? It really disappointed me back in the 80s, and so it does now. Stupid big dragon trapped inside a cave located under 5 weak pillars. Well, he's got his maths wrong because there's only 4 pillars, as you can see in the screenshot there. But otherwise, you can't really argue too much with those comments. Let's move on and have a look at ZZap. Another small review here. We'd obviously got to the period in time where they didn't give budget games full page reviews very often, so they gave it 41% and said, although well presented and smart looking, Rainbow Dragon is slow, cumbersome, has very obscure puzzles and unrewarding gameplay. Mappers and arcade adventurers may like it, but everyone else should think twice before reaching for a couple of pound coins. Yep, can't really argue with that either. That's a very fair assessment of the game, and that 41% is more like what I'd give it, probably 4 out of 10, even though my score gave it a 6. That just showed the flaws in my scoring calculation really, which we've seen previous times. Moving on then to the next game, and that was Silu, which I gave a score of 3.7, one of the worst games I've played in this series, in fact arguably the worst. Lemon users agree, they gave it 3.4. The poor robot on the cover just wants to reach out and touch you. That's talking about the cover artwork there. Let's just take another look at it there, which was one of the highlights of the game, to be honest. So moving on to other Lemon user comments. Controls are terrible, and your guy looks like a dog head with legs, and overall it's very boring. If you want something similar, play Molecule Man 1. Can I recommend you don't play Molecule Man, because that's just as bad as this. I reviewed that back in the Mastertronic days. Awful, enough said. The title screen looks good, but that's it. It's boring. Someone there used to play it for ages, but they obviously didn't have any better games to play. A rather poor, slow 3D isometric game that's been ported over from the Spectrum. Plenty to explore, but very dull. Yeah, couldn't agree more with most of those comments. So let's take a look at what Zap thought about it. Back in issue 6, October 85, they reviewed it when it was in the white and red packaging. You can see there, cost £2.50 at that point. Gave it quite comprehensive one-page review. So let's just go to the scores first of all, and the one thing that stands out is they gave it 65%. At 250, it's not too hot, rather dull with limited appeal. Nice 3D attempt, but everything's the same colour for the graphics, and I don't know what they're saying there about the sound, but nothing good. So all those things don't sound very good, but yet they still gave it a pretty slightly above average score, I would say. So let's just read one of the reviewer comments. Let's go with Julian Rignall, because he's usually a good judge of what a game's like. When I first saw this, I thought it was very similar to Night Law. On further playing, I discovered the similarity only went as far as the graphics. The game may have heaps of screens, but each room is really small, taking up less space than half the Commodore screen. The game itself is very hard, the control fiddly, and having to keep powering up Silo every few minutes was a real pain. I suppose it's another cartographer's delight. That's referring to people who like to make maps, obviously, but not one I'd really recommend even at its cheap price. So that seems like a fair review. It isn't really reflected in that 65% score overall. Yeah, it was a real pain to have to refuel Silo every few minutes, and that made it more frustrating than it needed to be. So I don't think we need to say any more there. I think that's a pretty strange review from Zap there, because they don't really say anything good about it yet give it a pretty decent score. So moving on, next up was Denarius, which I gave a score of 6.7. Lemon user's been a bit more harsh there. They've given it 5 out of 10. Let's read a couple of comments. There aren't many comments actually, just the 3. The first game I brought to my Commodore 64. I really love this game, just a mindless blast 'em up from the past. A great shoot 'em up for $1.99. Well, I'd say it's an average shoot 'em up for $1.99 personally. Not a bad blast, worth a try. Played it sometimes when I got bored of my early games, but never cleared it. So not really much insight from the users there. So let's move on to Zap, and they gave it a score of 57% with a half-page colour review. A very blurry one, it has to be said. That's the ship there. That's got some interesting motion blur on it, that picture. So 57%. Graphics to give a pretty good score, and the sound, stirring title tune and reasonable sound effects, and I think I agreed with that. Lastability, it's enjoyable, but the repetitive action and levels eventually lead to boredom. A colourful and noisy shoot 'em up which lacks substance. I would say that's pretty fair. So let's take a look at the reviewer comments. Didn't really enjoy playing this average vertically scrolling blaster. Going back to the beginning of each stage after losing a life is annoying and unnecessary, and in the end I only found myself enjoying the sub game because it's simple and challenging. At £2, an average shoot 'em up fan might be able to milk some enjoyment out of it, but avoid it if you're getting bored with playing the same sort of game time and time again. And Julian Rignall, let's quickly just skim through his. Just when you thought the vertically scrolling format had been milk dry, another attempt is made to squeeze a little more life out of the genre. Polished but lacks 2 vital elements, excitement and novelty. Bonus game compensates a little, but in the end the action becomes repetitive. It's a shame there isn't a bit more depth of gameplay to support the polished graphics and sound. Interesting that he's not been very complimentary about it, particularly because you might recall I didn't really mention this at the time because I didn't know, and someone pointed it out in the video comments when I did the review. The Rignallian race is obviously named after Julian Rignall, but that didn't seem to be enough to convince him that it was worth giving it a good score. Moving on then, the next game I reviewed was Pogo Stick Olympics, which I gave a score of 4.7, and Lemon users, all 6 of them that voted, gave it an even more damning score of 3.2. Only a few comments here. 4 out of 10 only for the Matt Gray tune and decent graphics. The game itself is crap. This game belongs to the category games no one needs. And finally, Michael said the worst game ever made, which is probably not far off the truth. Probably not the worst, but definitely amongst the worst. So the other thing you'll notice here is there's no link to a ZZap review of this game. In fact, I couldn't find any reviews of the Commodore 64 versions from any of the magazines back in the 80s. So I've had to bring in a guest publication for a magazine review of this game, and the only one I could find is Crash Magazine issue 55. Here's their review in Crash. So let's skim down straight away to the review scores. You can see they gave it an overall score of 20%, presentation 20, graphics 30, playability 25, addictive qualities 19. Some interesting categories they used in Crash, I think. So just to look at some of the reviewer comments. So Phil, whoever he is, says progress is so easy that even a 3-year-old could complete this game, which makes it sound like that version of the game on the Spectrum was a bit easier than the Commodore 64 one. I thought the only place where pogoing remained in fashion was in the pages of the Beano. The game contains very tedious events, none of which is in the least bit playable. And at the bottom there it says, if this is what pogoing is about, give me a skateboard any day. And then the other reviewer, I think that says Katie, gave it 19%. It doesn't really simulate anything very much. All you can do is waggle the joystick, press fire every now and then and hope for the best. Jerky graphics and simplistic backdrops mean that you can't even enjoy the scenery as you're bounding along. So basically it looks like the Spectrum version was rated just as high or low as the Commodore 64 version. It sounds very similar in terms of the gameplay. The graphics look pretty similar as well. But with the limitations colour-wise of the Spectrum, so it probably didn't even get a very good score for graphics. But yeah, overall, Crash gave it 20%, and I imagine if it had been reviewed in ZZap, it wouldn't have got much better a score than that. Moving on then, and next we have Ricochet, which was one of the highlights of this last batch of 10 games I've reviewed. I gave it a score of 8, and Lemon Users not quite as generous, they've given it a score of 6. But a few comments here. I believe that is just the best breakout game. The smart power-up system makes you plan your strategy and use the bonuses when they're really required. So that's a very positive comment. Just skim through and see if we can... There's a slightly opposing view here. One of the most stupid breakout games I've ever seen. They obviously didn't get it, I guess. Breakout games have never been my favourite genre, but this game was good. Pretty mad digitised music. Bit of a piss take on the breakout clones that were popular at the time, quite funny and entertaining for some times. Plenty of reasonably positive comments. Better than Arkanoid, one says there. The best breakout game ever. The music by Rob Hubbard is simply fantastic. So yeah, pretty much positive reviews, apart from a couple of people who perhaps didn't quite get that it was meant to be a fun kind of comedy game as well as being a fairly serious breakout game as well. So let's move on to the ZZap review. And they gave it a score quite similar to mine, 86%, and pretty good scores overall for all the categories. It's 80% or higher. So the reviewer comments say it's undoubtedly Ricochet's sense of humour and originality which sets it apart from the other games, which I would agree with. Wacky samples, silly sprites, jolly messages and obscure references form part of the varied and imaginative breakout screens. It goes on to talk about the power-ups, and then it finally says, with several good similar games on the shelves at the same price, Ricochet isn't the best buy around, but it's worthy of a die-hard Arkanoid fan's attention. And the second comment says, just as breakout games were starting to become much of a muchness, Ricochet bursts onto our C64s. The humour virtually slaps you in the face, complete with caricature sprites of software industry celebs and silly screen names. They go on to say, I'm also glad to see a little more imagination being put into the actual screen designs, like Pac-Man shapes instead of the usual square brick patterns. Despite being very derivative, Ricochet is quite simply a good game, highly recommended. So there you go. Couldn't agree more with either of those review comments there. Moving on then to the next game, which was another duffer in my opinion, Happiest Days of Your Life. I gave this a score of 4.6. Lemon Users a little bit more generous, they've given it 6.1. But there's some interesting comments here. Playing this game made me miserable. A game in the everyone's a Wally mould, although its logic defied belief. I don't think I ever solved a single puzzle. There's a comment here about the guy on the cover. It says you can't really tell from the pic here, but the kid on the cover art looks really scary, like a cross between a chimp and Freddy Krueger. I did comment that he didn't look like a school kid particularly. Another one saying it's just like everyone's a Wally, enjoyed exploring, admiring the many locations and graphics, but never knew the goal of the game. Lots of other comments there, which we're not going to go through in too much detail. So again, this is another one that doesn't have a ZZap review, and I couldn't find a review of the Commodore 64 version in any of the other magazines of the era either. So I've gone back to my guest publication for this episode, which is Crash, this time issue number 34. And they did a full page review of the happiest days of your life. Lots of detail, including the controls and things like that. I'm just going to zoom it in a little bit because it's quite hard to read some of this, definitely for you guys watching, I'm sure. So let's just zoom it in a little bit. There we go. So we'll just get to the review scores first. They gave it an overall score of 64%, all of the scores in the mid 60s. So for use of colour, it says pretty locations but lots of clash, which wouldn't really apply to the Commodore 64. Graphics, it says in the Wally Week style, which is referring again to Everyone's a Wally and those other games in that series. For sound, it said there was a tune at the beginning of the game, which we didn't get in the Commodore 64 version. The general rating at the end there says a reasonable clone of a popular game format. And if we dig into the reviewer comments a little bit, the first one in bold here doesn't say who made these comments, by the way. They're just 3 separate comments, but it says the characters are fairly well detailed but animated badly, and the sound is dire. There are no tunes and very few effects, so that did apply for the Commodore 64. Didn't really enjoy playing this one as it's unoriginal and badly presented. It then goes on in this last comment here to say, if you're a Wally Week fan currently sulking because Microgen have abandoned your hero, fret no more. Here's a game in the same mould. It's a very neat clone of the game style made famous by Everyone's a Wally and should appeal to anyone who isn't yet tired of the format. Nothing original here, but lovers of puzzle and mapping games should find this a worthwhile purchase. And I would say that was probably fair considering it was only $1.99, but for me it's just a poor style of game, not a game style I was ever interested in, and that's why I rated it lower than the magazines and Lemon. Up next was another poor game, Turbo Boat Simulator. I gave this a score of 5.2, and that's probably better than it deserved, to be perfectly honest. And Lemon users have given it a score of 4.2 with just the one comment: I couldn't even beat the first level on this game, very crap indeed. And again, we've got no ZZap review here either, another one that was never reviewed in any of the Commodore 64 magazines. So once again I'm going to have to go back to Crash, third appearance by my guest publication, this time issue 63, and there's a very small review of the game here in the budget section, and it says Turbo Boat Simulator, they're giving it 32%, a nautical but not very nice shoot 'em up, lost in enemy territory your boat patrols horizontally scrolling waterways, blah blah blah. Grotty monochromatic graphics don't give much incentive to play on in a game that is about as exciting as squashed hedgehog racing. Its best feature is definitely the 128k title tune. Well, those comments don't really apply to the Commodore 64 version, but I think we can get the gist that it wasn't particularly highly regarded on the Spectrum either. Just 2 games left to go then, and these both did get reviewed in ZZap, you'll be pleased to hear. And first up for these last 2 is Eyeball 2, which was a Spectrum game ported over to the Commodore 64 ironically. I gave this a score of 6.1, and Lemon users are pretty much in agreement with the score of 6.3. Couple of comments then here. As with its predecessor, saved by the sound, slightly different playstyle but still chronically frustrating. Well, I don't think it was as frustrating as the first game personally. Someone not very happy here. Why are you lot so fucking harsh on the Eyeball series? Some comments about the Spectrum style graphics. There's lots of poor comments here actually, even though the overall rating is pretty decent. Someone here saying I never liked the first parts of this one, didn't give me any satisfaction at all. Yeah, pretty much all the comments are bad, even though the game itself has got a pretty reasonable rating. Okay, so let's move on to the ZZap review, and as we can see here in issue 35 they gave it 90% and a silver medal, which is a little bit much. I think it was a decent enough game, but I think 90%. They did give the original game a really high score as well. Interestingly, on the other side of here is BMX Kids, which we've already seen. So yeah, in terms of the review scores, they're giving 54% for the graphics, so they're noting that they are quite poor Spectrum ported graphics, but good score for the sound. Hookability and lastability are good as well. Presentation is probably rated a little bit too highly. I think that overall rating is at least 10 to 15% too high personally. They said it's a more than worthy sequel and a very entertaining game in its own right. Those comments are true, but I don't agree with the score. So there's a lot of mention here about the sound in this one. I can see Get Ready, Go For It says the surprisingly clear voice at the beginning of this brilliant collect 'em up / platform game. Moving on to the Julian Rignall review, because he just seems to be going on about the sound pretty much. So let's see if we can pick anything useful out of this. This sequel is a very different game to Eyeball, since the emphasis is more on platform skills, with the blasting taking a back seat. Not as many customizations available. Some of the original's cuteness has been lost. Still a very playable game once you get hold of the initially awkward control method, even if it's extremely frustrating at times, which I would agree with. The speech is brill, the effects are appropriate. The only major fault is on some screens you have to wait for something to happen before you can progress. It's not a matter of skill, just patience. Even so, he's got no hesitation in recommending it. So there you go. I feel that was a bit overrated by ZZap, but there you go, that's what they thought of it at the time. So finally, to round this edition of the review comparison video off, we've got Zenji, which I gave a score of 7.4, and the Lemon users have given it 7.1, so pretty much the same. There's a lovely warm Japanese atmosphere flowing throughout this game, delivered by a combination of Eastern sounding music and a suitably adorned player sprite. Yep, that's fair. The gameplay is a joy, a simple idea made good with polish and design. As always with these games, I don't see the point in the time limit, but it's there, like it or loathe it. Yeah, I'd agree with those comments completely, and the score 7 out of 10. Let's just quickly skim through and see if there's anything else. Nice concept, but sometimes you're stuck not because you don't know what to do, but because the baddies keep on walking on the tiles next to you. Struggling with time limit, it can be very upsetting. Wow, poor guy, he got really a bit emotional about this. Nevertheless, the game is good, definitely worth playing. Another one here saying the time limit should have been way more generous. So yeah, plenty of pretty positive comments there and a pretty positive score as well. So let's skip on over to ZZap, who gave it 91%, and this was a review of the budget re-release. You can see there from the price, nice colour screenshots. So yeah, they gave it 91%, easily the cheapest and best puzzle game to date. An awful lot of enjoyment for the lowest possible price. Graphics 67%, sound 63%, so that's pretty much what I'd say. Kind of middle of the road for the graphics and sound, but a good playable game. So let's quickly take a look at the reviewer comments, and you can see Julian Rignall said, well, it's the best puzzle game ever. In billions of years of history, there's never been anything better. Amazing. Even more amazing is it only costs £2. Buy it and believe it. I feel like there's a little bit of sarcasm coming through there, but he obviously did enjoy it. And Gary Penn there says, while most puzzle games are maddeningly frustrating, Zenji has a relaxing, almost therapeutic effect. I wouldn't go quite that far. It can be a bit stressful with the time limit, but there you go. Zenji is immensely playable, grossly addictive and temptingly cheap. And the final one here, a decent puzzle game, makes a nice break from blasting aliens, and Zenji is probably the best on the 64. Wow, they really did all like it then, it seems. The graphics are simple but totally effective, with the music also adding an enormous amount, getting faster as the time limit approaches. This induces a sensation of increasing panic even when you're doing alright. I'm totally hooked, I think you will be too. So yeah, positive reviews across the board for Zenji. I'm not sure I'd go as far as to give it 90% plus, I didn't in my review, but it's definitely a good game and highly enjoyable. I also found another review of Zenji in a later edition of ZZap. This is from issue 40, the Deaf Guide to Puzzle Games, and they gave it their Deaf Award, which means it's the best of the bunch, and actually gave it 97% on this one. I'm not going to go into too much detail about it, but it was a guide to puzzle games. They gave Zenji 97%, and if you go through this, there's also some other Firebird / Silverbird games in here. You've got Brainstorm there, which they gave 89%. And then if we move on to the next page, they also gave a review to Collapse, which is another game I enjoyed, and they gave that 88%. So overall, what you can read from this particular article is that Firebird released some pretty decent puzzle games, and that was their top 5, with Zenji sitting there at the top. So finally, just as I always do to round off these review comparison videos, let's have a look at the games ranked from best to worst by each medium, myself, ZZap, and guest publication Crash in this case, and Lemon. So here they are, and the first thing to look at, let's take a look at the averages first. These have to be the lowest averages of any set of 10 games so far, especially the Lemon users who've averaged at under 5. ZZap's is just over 6 and mine is under 6, which I think is unusual. So looking at them side by side, you can see that ZZap and Lemon are pretty much in agreement at the top there, with Zenji, Eyeball 2, Ricochet all featuring, and Zenji, Eyeball 2 and Ricochet all feature at least in the top half of my list. Denarius is all over the place, quite highly rated for me, not so much for the others. If we go down to the bottom, again it's a bit of a mixed bag, but Pogo Stick Olympics is consistently at the bottom, and Turboboat Simulator's down there as well. Silu is the strange one. I've got it right at the bottom, and Lemon users have got it pretty close to the bottom as well, but Zap rated it really too highly at 65%. That was a massive overration, if that's a word. Obviously having to factor in that some of these were crash reviews, but they kind of fit in generally with the opinion of the games. Actually, Happiest Days of Your Life is all over the place as well. Third place in fact on the Lemon scores, sort of in the middle. That's based on the crash review, remember, and mine's right down near the bottom. So yeah, generally speaking, Rainbow Dragon's another one that's a little bit all over the place, right near the bottom for Lemon users, somewhere near the bottom for Zap, and somewhere in the middle for me, but I really don't rate it as a 6 out of 10 game. I just happen to rate it that way because of how my rating system works. So all things considered, the scores are all over the place, which is pretty much how it goes with these. There's very rarely much consensus, it seems, although I think it's fair to say that Zenji was the best of the bunch along with Ricochet. Those are the top two in my opinion, and also very high up there for the other two. So there you have it, that's 60 games reviewed, only 36 left to go. Hope you've enjoyed watching this video, and if you've got any comments about the reviews or my scores or any of the other scores, then let me know. I'll be back with another game review fairly soon. Thanks for watching, and see you again in the next video.